A single question can destroy a man's entire understanding of his own past. Mason Caldwell had built his life on precision. At 36 years old, he was known as a disciplined and highly successful entrepreneur in Chicago, a man whose decisions were calculated, whose schedule was controlled, and whose emotional world was carefully contained behind layers of routine and ambition. Everything in his life had a purpose, a structure, and a predictable outcome. He did not believe in randomness, and he certainly did not believe in consequences he could not trace back to logic. That belief had carried him through years of growth in business, allowing him to expand his company into one of the most respected firms in his industry. To the outside world, Mason represented control in its purest form. But control, as he would later discover, is only as strong as the information it is built upon. On a cold morning in early spring, Mason sat inside his private office overlooking the city skyline, reviewing routine client files. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of electronics and the distant sound of traffic below. Everything appeared normal, predictable, and unchanged. Yet what he was about to encounter would fracture that sense of stability in a way he could not immediately recognize. The first disruption came not from a business deal or financial report, but from a simple, casual mention in a conversation that was not meant to carry weight. A colleague referred indirectly to a woman named Harper Collins, a name Mason had not heard in years. At first, it meant nothing. Names from the past often surfaced in professional environments without significance. But something about this one lingered in his attention longer than expected. Harper Collins was not part of his current life. She existed in a memory he had never fully defined, tied to a brief period in his past that he had long treated as insignificant. A single night, a moment without structure, an event he had never categorized as important enough to revisit. Mason had always believed that what lacked consequence did not deserve reflection. However, as the day progressed, the name returned again in an unexpected context. This time, it was connected to a child, a boy. The mention was brief, almost incidental, but it struck something unfamiliar in Mason's awareness. He did not react outwardly. His expression remained controlled, his responses measured, but internally, a question formed that he did not immediately allow himself to complete. He continued his day as scheduled, attending meetings, reviewing documents, and maintaining the appearance of complete composure. Yet beneath that structure, the name Harper Collins began to reappear in fragments of thought that were no longer fully under his control. That evening, Mason returned to his penthouse overlooking the river. The city lights reflected across the glass walls, creating an environment that usually reinforced his sense of order. But tonight, the order felt slightly misaligned, as if something subtle had shifted beneath the surface of his awareness. He poured himself a drink and stood by the window, replaying the conversation in his mind. The mention of a boy remained unclear, unverified, and yet it carried a weight that did not match its simplicity. Mason Caldwell had built his life on certainty, but for the first time in years, certainty was no longer absolute. A question had entered his world without permission, and it refused to leave. The moment the name Harper Collins resurfaced in Mason Caldwell's awareness, it did not remain an isolated thought. It began to repeat itself in subtle variations throughout the following hours, each repetition carrying a slightly different emotional weight that he could not fully categorize. Mason continued his day with the same disciplined structure that defined his professional identity. He attended scheduled meetings, reviewed performance reports, and signed off on decisions that required absolute clarity of mind. To everyone observing him, nothing had changed. He remained the same controlled, precise, and efficient executive he had always been. Yet internally, there was a deviation forming beneath that surface stability. The memory associated with Harper Collins was not clear enough to be actionable, yet not distant enough to be dismissed. It existed in a space that resisted classification. By late afternoon, Mason found himself revisiting the earlier conversation that had introduced the name. He attempted to trace the context in which it had been mentioned, but the details were fragmented. What remained consistent, however, was the reference to a child, a boy. That single element persisted in his mind longer than any other part of the exchange. He did not immediately assign meaning to it, but he also did not fully let it go. That balance between dismissal and retention created a cognitive tension that followed him into the evening. When Mason returned to his penthouse that night, the atmosphere felt unchanged, yet his perception of it was no longer entirely neutral. The city skyline stretched across the horizon, illuminated by structured patterns of light that normally reinforced his sense of control. He stood near the window for several minutes without speaking, holding his attention on the distant movement of traffic below, as if external order could restore internal clarity. But the question that had entered his awareness earlier that day remained unresolved. HarperCollins, the boy, the absence of context. These fragments did not connect into a coherent narrative, yet they refused to separate into insignificance. Mason poured himself a drink and set it aside without taking more than a few sips. His focus drifted again to the incomplete structure forming in his mind. He attempted to reconstruct possible timelines, searching for logical explanations that would allow him to categorize the information as irrelevant. However, each attempt produced additional uncertainty rather than resolution. The lack of clarity itself began to feel like information. By the time he reached his desk, Mason had already begun reviewing archived personal records, not because he expected confirmation, but because the absence of confirmation had become difficult to ignore. He searched through past engagements, travel history, and personal notes from the period in question. Everything appeared consistent with his established memory, yet there was a gap that he could not fully explain. That gap was not defined by missing data alone, but by the feeling that something had once existed within it. As the night deepened, Mason sat alone in silence, surrounded by the quiet precision of his penthouse environment. The structure of his life remained intact, but within that structure, a single unresolved question continued to expand. He did not yet know what it meant. He only knew that it was no longer possible to treat it as insignificant. Something from his past had begun to reassert itself in his present, and the uncertainty it carried was no longer contained within memory alone. By the following morning, Mason Caldwell's awareness of the unresolved reference to HarperCollins had evolved into a persistent cognitive loop that no longer responded to simple dismissal. He continued his structured routine with the same external discipline that defined his professional identity, attending early meetings and reviewing updated reports from his executive team. To anyone observing from the outside, there was no indication of disruption. His communication remained precise, his decisions remained consistent, and his demeanor reflected the same controlled stability expected of someone in his position. Internally, however, the unresolved reference had developed a sustained presence that now influenced the way he processed even unrelated information. The mention of a boy had not provided clarity, but it had created a directional focus in his thinking that persisted beyond context. Mason found himself returning to the same sequence of questions without consciously initiating them. Who was HarperCollins in relation to his past? Why the reference had surfaced now? And most significantly, what connection existed between the boy and any period of his life that he could currently account for? Throughout the morning, he attempted to maintain separation between operational decision-making and these unresolved internal questions. In practice, he succeeded in preserving functional performance. Yet the cognitive separation he relied on was no longer absolute. During a financial review session, he noticed brief interruptions in his attention that were not tied to external distraction. These interruptions were subtle, lasting only moments, but they represented a deviation from his usual cognitive consistency. He did not acknowledge them during the meeting, nor did he allow them to influence his responses. However, afterward, he reviewed the session internally and recognized that his focus had not been as continuous as he would normally expect. That realization led him to further scrutiny of his own mental processes, which in turn reinforced the persistence of the unresolved question. By midday, Mason had begun compiling a private timeline reconstruction, drawing from archived records, travel logs, and professional engagements from the period in which he believed the original encounter with HarperCollins might have occurred. The data itself appeared complete, yet the alignment between external records and internal memory was increasingly inconsistent. There were periods that should have carried more clarity but instead felt undefined, as though the emotional or contextual weight associated with them had been removed or never fully recorded. This discrepancy created a tension that Mason could not resolve through logic alone. That evening, he remained in his office longer than usual, continuing to analyze fragmented information that did not form a cohesive narrative. The city outside his windows transitioned from daylight into night, but his focus remained fixed on internal reconstruction. The boy remained the central point of unresolved significance. It was not the detail itself that created uncertainty, but the implication that accompanied it without explanation. Mason did not yet assign emotional meaning to the situation, but he could no longer categorize it as irrelevant. When he finally left his office and returned to his penthouse, the environment offered the same visual consistency it always had. Yet his perception of that environment had subtly changed. The structure of his life remained intact, but within that structure, an unresolved variable had begun to influence his internal equilibrium. As he stood alone by the window, looking out across the illuminated city, Mason Caldwell understood that the question he had first dismissed as incidental was no longer contained within the boundaries of memory alone. It had become a problem that extended into the present, and its resolution, if it existed, would require confronting a part of his past that he could no longer fully account for. By the time Mason Caldwell reached the midpoint of the following day, the unresolved presence of HarperCollins and the reference to a boy had shifted from a background concern into a structured cognitive priority that influenced his entire pattern of thought processing. Although his external responsibilities remained unchanged, his internal focus had begun to allocate increasing attention toward reconstructing a timeline that no longer aligned cleanly with his established memory. He continued to operate within his professional environment with the same level of efficiency expected of him, attending executive meetings, reviewing operational data, and making decisions that required precise judgment. To everyone around him, Mason remained unchanged. However, internally, the continuity of his attention was no longer uniformly distributed. During a scheduled strategic review, Mason found himself momentarily disengaging from the spoken analysis of financial projections. The interruption was brief and externally unnoticeable, yet internally it represented a deviation from his standard cognitive control. He recovered quickly and continued the discussion without hesitation, maintaining his professional presence. Yet after the meeting concluded, he noted the irregularity with increasing awareness. It was not the interruption itself that concerned him, but the fact that it occurred without identifiable external cause. This led him to intensify his private investigation into archived records and personal history from the relevant time period. He accessed travel logs, communication records, and meeting summaries, attempting to locate any point of origin for the reference to HarperCollins. The data available appeared consistent on the surface, yet the internal alignment between memory and documentation continued to produce gaps that could not be easily resolved. The boy remained the most significant unresolved element. It was not the presence of the child itself that created tension, but the implication that his existence introduced into Mason's understanding of his own past. As he reviewed the records more deeply, he began to notice that certain periods of time lacked the expected clarity he normally associated with his recollection. These were not missing entries in documentation, but rather sections of memory that did not correspond with external structure in a meaningful way. This discrepancy introduced a level of uncertainty that Mason could not categorize within his usual analytical frameworks. That evening, he remained in his office long after his team had left, continuing to cross-reference information that refused to converge into a coherent narrative. The city outside transitioned into night, its lights forming a stable and predictable pattern that contrasted with the instability of his internal process. Despite repeated attempts to isolate the origin of the reference, each layer of analysis led only to additional ambiguity. The more he examined, the less definitive the connection became, yet the persistence of the question itself remained unchanged. When he finally returned to his penthouse, the silence of the space was familiar, but his perception of it was no longer fully neutral. The structure of his life still functioned with precision, yet within that structure, a single unresolved variable continued to influence his internal equilibrium. Standing at the window overlooking the city, Mason Caldwell recognized that the question he had initially encountered as a minor inconsistency had now become a persistent cognitive disruption that could not be resolved through standard logic alone. It was no longer simply a matter of missing information. It was the growing possibility that the information he relied upon to define his past might itself be incomplete in a way he could no longer fully reconstruct. By the following morning, the cognitive instability that Mason Caldwell had begun to experience had evolved into a persistent state of unresolved analysis that no longer remained confined to isolated moments of reflection. His external routine continued without disruption. He attended scheduled executive briefings, reviewed updated financial projections, and maintained the level of professional composure expected of someone in his position. To any observer, there was no indication of deviation from his standard operational behavior. Internally, however, the unresolved reference to HarperCollins and the associated mention of a boy had progressed beyond a simple investigative concern. It had become a continuous background process influencing how he interpreted fragmented pieces of information throughout the day. Mason attempted to maintain separation between his professional decision-making and the private reconstruction of his past, but the distinction between the two was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. During a mid-morning review session, he experienced a brief interruption in cognitive continuity that did not correspond to any external stimulus. The interruption was subtle, lasting only a few seconds, but it represented a deviation from his usual mental consistency. He did not acknowledge it during the meeting, nor did it affect his external responses. Yet internally, it contributed to a growing awareness that his cognitive processing was no longer operating with complete uniformity. After the session ended, Mason reviewed the discussion in detail, not for strategic improvement, but for evidence of where and why his attention had shifted. This internal examination led him back once again to the unresolved sequence of questions surrounding HarperCollins. He resumed his private investigation into archived records, expanding his search across older communication logs and historical engagement summaries. The data available remained structurally intact, yet it failed to provide the coherence he expected when aligning memory with documentation. Certain time periods appeared disproportionately vague when compared to their expected significance, not because information was missing, but because the internal association he once had with those periods no longer aligned with external structure in a reliable way. The boy remained the central unresolved factor. Mason did not yet assign emotional interpretation to the existence of the child, but the implication of his presence introduced a variable that affected the way he evaluated all related data. Each attempt to clarify the timeline produced additional inconsistencies that could not be resolved through standard analytical methods. That evening, Mason extended his review beyond professional records into personal archives, attempting to reconstruct a complete sequence of events that might explain the origin of the reference. The city outside his penthouse transitioned from daylight into night, maintaining its predictable rhythm, while his internal process continued without resolution. The more he analyzed the available information, the more apparent it became that the issue was not simply one of missing data, but of structural misalignment between memory and recorded history. When he finally paused his investigation, it was not due to resolution, but due to diminishing returns in clarity. Standing alone in the quiet of his penthouse, Mason observed the city lights below, each one representing order and continuity that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty forming within his own perception. For the first time, he acknowledged internally that the question he had initially treated as an anomaly was no longer contained within the boundaries of routine inquiry. It had evolved into a persistent disruption of certainty that no longer responded to logic alone. And within that realization, Mason Caldwell understood that the foundation of what he believed about his past was no longer fully stable, and the answer he was searching for might require confronting a truth that had remained outside his constructed understanding of reality. The final stage of Mason Caldwell's investigation did not arrive through a sudden revelation, but through the gradual collapse of confidence in the internal framework he had used to interpret his own past. Over the previous days, his professional life had continued without disruption. He attended executive meetings, reviewed financial projections, and maintained the external consistency expected of a high-level corporate leader. To anyone observing him, nothing appeared unusual. Yet internally, the unresolved reference to HarperCollins and the associated presence of a boy had evolved into a structural uncertainty that no longer behaved like a simple, missing piece of information. It had become a persistent condition of cognitive instability that influenced how he interpreted both memory and documentation. Mason had attempted to resolve the inconsistency through systematic analysis. He had reviewed archived records, cross-referenced timelines, and examined personal logs from the relevant period. Each layer of investigation had produced data that appeared complete in isolation, yet failed to converge into a coherent narrative when combined with his internal recollection. The issue was no longer the absence of information, but the mismatch between recorded structure and perceived continuity. By the evening of the following day, Mason extended his review into deeper historical records, attempting to identify any reference point that could anchor the timeline of HarperCollins within a verifiable context. He worked through communication archives, travel summaries, and professional engagements, carefully reconstructing sequences that should have provided clarity. However, the more detail he uncovered, the more fragmented the overall picture became. Certain intervals that should have contained meaningful interactions appeared unusually neutral, lacking the contextual markers he would normally associate with personal relevance. This discrepancy created a level of analytical tension that could not be resolved through logic alone. The boy remained the central, unresolved element. Mason did not yet assign emotional meaning to this fact, but the implication of his existence continued to affect how he interpreted every related fragment of data. Each attempt to isolate a definitive origin point only expanded the scope of uncertainty, as if the structure of the timeline itself resisted consolidation into a single consistent version. That night, Mason remained in his penthouse long after his team had left. The city outside maintained its predictable rhythm, lights moving through familiar patterns that contrasted sharply with the instability forming within his internal analysis. He reviewed the same records repeatedly, attempting to identify any inconsistency in the data that could explain the gap between memory and documentation. Yet each review produced the same outcome. The information was complete, but the narrative was not. When he finally stepped away from his desk, it was not because he had reached a conclusion, but because continued analysis no longer produced new clarity. Standing at the window, Mason observed the city below with a level of detachment that had not been present before this sequence of events began. The structure of his external world remained unchanged, but his internal framework for interpreting that world had lost a degree of stability. For the first time since the initial reference to HarperCollins, Mason Caldwell acknowledged that the issue was no longer confined to a question of identity or relationship. It had become a fundamental uncertainty within his own continuity of memory, one that suggested the possibility that what he believed about a specific part of his past might not be fully complete, and that the truth he was searching for might exist outside the boundaries of what he was currently able to reconstruct. The continuation of Mason Caldwell's internal investigation did not progress through sudden discovery, but through a gradual erosion of certainty that reshaped the way he interpreted every fragment of information he reviewed. By this point, his professional life remained entirely unaffected. He continued to operate within his established routine, attending executive meetings, reviewing corporate strategies, and making decisions with the same precision that had always defined his role. Externally, there was no indication of disruption. Internally, however, the unresolved reference to HarperCollins and the associated presence of a boy had evolved into a persistent analytical focus that no longer behaved like a temporary concern. It had become a structural inconsistency within his perception of his own past. Over the previous day, Mason had expanded his search across all available personal and professional records, attempting to locate any definitive anchor point that could reconcile memory with documentation. He examined archived communications, travel histories, and structured event logs from the relevant time period, expecting that deeper analysis would eventually produce clarity. Instead, each layer of review reinforced the same pattern. The available data was complete in form, yet incomplete in meaning when compared to his internal recollection. Certain time segments that should have carried clear contextual significance appeared unusually neutral, lacking the associative markers he would normally expect to exist in his own memory. This created a form of analytical tension that no longer responded to standard reasoning. The more he attempted to isolate inconsistencies, the more the overall structure of his timeline resisted consolidation. By the following evening, Mason found himself revisiting the same records repeatedly, not because new information had appeared, but because the absence of resolution had become increasingly difficult to ignore. The boy remained the central, unresolved factor. Mason did not assign emotional interpretation to this fact, but its implication continued to influence the way he evaluated every related fragment of data. The possibility that such a presence existed within his past without a clearly defined origin introduced a level of uncertainty that could not be resolved through conventional verification methods. That night, he remained in his penthouse beyond his usual working hours, continuing to examine archived materials with sustained focus. The city outside maintained its predictable rhythm, lights moving through structured patterns that contrasted sharply with the instability forming within his internal analysis. Despite repeated attempts to reconstruct a coherent timeline, each review produced the same outcome. The records themselves remained consistent, but the narrative they formed failed to align with his internal understanding of events. When he finally paused his investigation, it was not due to resolution, but due to the diminishing return of continued analysis. Standing near the window, Mason observed the city below, yet his perception of it no longer carried the same sense of cognitive alignment it once had. The external environment remained unchanged, but his internal framework for interpreting continuity had become less stable. For the first time since the initial reference to HarperCollins, Mason Caldwell acknowledged that the issue he was facing was no longer simply about missing information. It had become a fundamental question about the reliability of his own reconstructed memory. And within that realization, he understood that the truth he was searching for might not be hidden within the records he had already examined, but within a gap in understanding that no amount of external verification alone could fully resolve. The final stage of Mason Caldwell's investigation unfolded not as a breakthrough, but as the complete exhaustion of all familiar methods he had relied upon to define certainty. Over the previous days, his structured life had continued without interruption. He attended executive meetings, reviewed financial performance reports, and maintained full control over his professional responsibilities. To any external observer, there had been no deviation in his behavior, no indication that anything beyond routine analysis occupied his attention. Internally, however, the unresolved reference to HarperCollins and the persistent implication of a boy had become a fixed cognitive presence that no longer behaved like an ordinary question. It had evolved into a structural uncertainty embedded within his perception of his own past. Mason had exhausted every conventional method of verification available to him. He had reviewed archived communications, reconstructed timelines, and cross-referenced historical records from multiple systems. Each layer of investigation had produced data that appeared consistent in isolation, yet failed to align with his internal recollection when assembled into a unified narrative. The problem was no longer the absence of information, but the inability of available information to resolve into a coherent structure when compared against memory. As he reached the final phase of his review, Mason began to recognize a pattern that had persisted throughout all his attempts. The inconsistencies he encountered were not located in the external data itself, but in the relationship between that data and his internal continuity of experience. Certain periods of time that should have carried emotional or contextual significance appeared disproportionately neutral when examined through documentation, while simultaneously retaining a sense of unresolved importance within his memory. This divergence created a condition that could not be corrected through further analysis alone. That evening, Mason remained in his penthouse long after the city had settled into its nighttime rhythm. The environment around him remained unchanged, structured, and predictable, yet his internal cognitive state had shifted into a level of sustained uncertainty that no longer fluctuated with external input. He reviewed the same records repeatedly, not in search of new data, but in search of a structural alignment that might restore coherence between memory and documentation. However, each repetition reinforced the same outcome. The information was complete, but the narrative was not. The boy remained the central, unresolved factor. Mason did not assign emotional meaning to this presence, yet its implication continued to influence every attempt he made to interpret the available data. The possibility that such a presence existed within his past without a clearly defined origin introduced a level of uncertainty that could not be resolved through traditional verification methods. As he reached the end of his analytical process, Mason understood that continued examination would not produce additional clarity. The limitation was no longer in the data he had accessed, but in the framework through which he was attempting to interpret it. When he finally stepped away from his desk and approached the window, the city below appeared unchanged, its lights forming a consistent pattern of order and continuity. Yet his perception of that order was no longer fully aligned with his internal state. The structure of his life remained intact, but the structure of his certainty had begun to weaken in a way that could not be stabilized through logic alone. In that final moment of reflection, Mason Caldwell acknowledged that the question he had been pursuing was no longer simply about identifying missing information. It had become a confrontation with the possibility that his understanding of his own past might be fundamentally incomplete, and that the truth he sought might exist beyond the limits of what his current perception of memory and reality could fully reconstruct. The final realization did not arrive as a sudden revelation, but as the complete structural collapse of Mason Caldwell's attempt to reconcile memory with recorded history. Over the previous days, he had continued his professional life without interruption. He attended executive meetings, finalized strategic decisions, and maintained the full operational control expected of his position. To the outside world, nothing had changed. His presence remained composed, his communication precise, and his behavior consistent with the same disciplined standard that had defined his career for years. Internally, however, the unresolved reference to HarperCollins and the persistent implication of a boy had evolved into a condition that no longer resembled a simple investigative concern. It had become a permanent instability within his cognitive framework, influencing how he interpreted every attempt at reconstructing his past. Mason had exhausted every method of verification available to him. He had reviewed archived communication logs, reconstructed timelines from multiple data sources, and cross-referenced structured records from the relevant period. Each attempt had produced information that was internally consistent but externally unresolving. The data aligned with itself, yet failed to align with his memory in a way that could restore continuity. The issue was no longer missing information. It was the absence of a bridge between what was recorded and what he was able to internally confirm as coherent experience. As he reached the final stage of his analysis, Mason began to understand that the instability he was experiencing did not originate from external records alone. It originated from the inability of those records to restore a unified structure within his perception of time. Certain periods of his past remained disproportionately undefined, not because they lacked documentation, but because they lacked continuity when compared against his internal sense of narrative order. This created a condition in which both memory and record existed independently, without reconciliation. That evening, Mason remained in his penthouse long after the city had entered its quiet nighttime rhythm. The environment around him remained unchanged, structured, and predictable, yet his internal cognitive state had reached a point where further analysis no longer produced incremental clarity. He reviewed the same materials repeatedly, not in search of new evidence, but in search of alignment between two versions of reality that refused to converge. However, every repetition reinforced the same conclusion. The structure was complete, but the meaning was not. The boy remained the central, unresolved factor. Mason did not assign emotional interpretation to this fact, yet its presence continued to shape the way he processed every related fragment of information. The implication of such a presence existing within his past without a clearly traceable origin introduced a level of uncertainty that could not be resolved through conventional analytical methods. As the night progressed, Mason reached the point where continued examination no longer altered the outcome of his understanding. The limitation was not in the availability of data, but in the framework through which that data was being interpreted. When he finally stood at the window overlooking the city, he observed the same structured patterns of light that had always defined the external world he controlled. Yet internally, that structure no longer provided the same sense of alignment. The certainty he had built his identity upon had become partially detached from the continuity of his own reconstructed memory. In that final moment of realization, Mason Caldwell understood that the question he had been pursuing was no longer simply about identifying a missing piece of information. It was about confronting the possibility that the version of his past he relied upon might be incomplete in a way that could not be resolved through analysis alone, and that the truth he sought might exist beyond the boundaries of what his current understanding of memory and reality was capable of fully reconstructing.